Please let me hide here. A small figure burst into the office like a gust of wind, gasping for breath. Annie Carter's face was pale, sweat shining along her forehead. The moment she got inside, she slammed the door shut and threw the security latch into place. Richard Whitmore jerked upright in his chair. Are you out of your mind? Who are you? For several seconds, the shock of what had just happened kept him frozen. Then years of discipline took over. He slowly lifted his gaze from the acquisition agreement spread across his desk and studied the trembling girl standing inside his private office. Richard pushed himself to his feet. His cold blue eyes moved over her once before flicking toward the clock on the wall. Dalpundias, Impart 10 RM. In 46 minutes, he was expected downstairs with bankers, board members, senior attorneys, and representatives from Northbridge Holdings for the final review of a $3.2 billion acquisition that had taken almost 2 years to negotiate. You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why an intern just broke into my office and destroyed my concentration on the morning of the biggest closing of my career. Start talking. His voice dropped into the controlled tone that had made experienced executives reconsider their words in the middle of board meetings. Annie Carter, she managed, forcing air back into her lungs. I'm an intern in legal operations. Richard's expression hardened. Then you're about 20 floors away from where you're supposed to be. I know, sir. Annie glanced through the narrow glass panel beside the door. Whatever she saw in the hallway made the little color remaining in her face disappear. I'm sorry, but I didn't know where else to go. He's coming. Richard stepped around the corner of his desk, his patience wearing thin. What are you talking about? His voice sharpened as he moved closer. This is one of the most secure corporate buildings in Atlanta. People don't get chased through my headquarters. So either calm down and explain yourself, or I'll have security do it for you. Annie swallowed and tried to force her thoughts into order. I was checking the Northbridge files downstairs, mostly file names, dates, version numbers, the things the legal team assigned me to verify. I found 2 disclosure schedules that were supposed to match, but they didn't. Richard's irritation eased just enough to allow curiosity through. How were they different? One version listed payments and liabilities that weren't in the final version. Annie ran one hand down the side of her skirt, trying to steady the trembling in her fingers. I didn't have enough time to understand everything because Mr. Hale came in almost immediately. Richard's eyes sharpened. Gregory Hale? Annie nodded. That name changed the weight of everything she had said. Richard's face became harder. Gregory has been the head of my legal department for 15 years. He has handled some of the most complicated transactions this company has ever completed. His eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you to accuse him of something like this? Annie looked straight at him despite the fear still shaking her voice. I'm nobody, sir. I know that. She took a breath. But the numbers don't care who I am. Northbridge's liabilities were removed from the final disclosure. Compliance records were changed. Mr. Hale is trying to get you to sign a deal that could leave this company holding debts and problems you were never told existed. Richard stared at her. The girl was wearing an intern badge and standing in the office of a billionaire as if her whole future depended on the next sentence. He lowered his voice. Tell me exactly what happened when Gregory walked in. Before Annie could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Closer now. Then came a knock. Firm, controlled, insistent. Richard, are you in there? Gregory Hale's voice carried through the thick wooden door, smooth and professional, as though nothing unusual had happened. I need to confirm one final detail in the contract schedule before we head down to the conference room. Richard looked at Annie, then at the door. He had spent most of his adult life making decisions before every fact was available. He knew fear could distort a story, make people exaggerate danger or misunderstand what they had seen. But power could distort stories too. Power could make a lie sound reasonable simply because it came from the right mouth. Annie looked at him again. This time she made no attempt to defend herself. Please, sir. Richard made his decision before he had fully explained it even to himself. His eyes shifted toward the space beneath his large walnut desk. Get under there. Annie stared at him. You want me to hide under your desk? Yes. His voice dropped. And I need you to move now. If you're telling me the truth, I want to hear what Gregory says when he doesn't know you're in this room. Annie dropped immediately to her knees and crawled beneath the desk, pressing herself into the darkest corner. Her heart was pounding so violently that for one irrational second she was afraid Gregory might hear it through the wood. Another 3 knocks struck the door. Richard returned to his chair, straightened the papers in front of him, and forced his expression back into the cold irritation everyone inside Whitmore Capital recognized. "Come in." Gregory Hale stepped through the door wearing a charcoal suit and crisp white shirt. He looked perfectly composed, except for the fact that he entered before Richard had truly given him permission to do so. "Richard, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation." Richard leaned back slightly. "Gregory, there is no reason for you to walk into my office without being invited. If the situation is serious enough to justify that, then explain it." Gregory paused. His gaze moved casually around the room before returning to Richard. "My apologies. It's just that I saw one of our interns running toward this hallway." He stopped to adjust his cuff. A legal operations intern accessed privileged acquisition documents and copied material she had no authorization to possess. When she was instructed to surrender it, she refused and left the department. Under the desk, Annie pulled her knees tighter against her chest. She could see Gregory's polished black shoes less than 10 feet away. Richard kept his voice level. "Which intern are we talking about?" "Annie Carter." Hearing her own name made Annie's stomach tighten. Gregory continued with the careful professionalism of an attorney giving a report he had already prepared in his head. She became agitated when she was questioned. "Given the sensitivity of the Northbridge transaction, I thought it was important to locate her before she approached anyone directly involved in the closing." Richard stared at him without blinking. "Let me make sure I understand you. You're telling me an 18-year-old intern stole privileged documents from your department? That appears to be what happened." Richard waited half a beat. "Then why are you personally looking for her?" Gregory hesitated. Less than a second. For most people, it would have meant nothing. Richard Whitmore had built companies by noticing moments other people dismissed. "The information she copied is extremely sensitive," Gregory replied. "I wanted to make certain it was contained as quickly as possible." Beneath the desk, Annie pressed one hand over her mouth. If Richard believed Gregory, everything she feared would happen at once. She would lose the internship. She would lose the recommendation she needed for school. More importantly, she would lose the paycheck that helped her mother buy medication and groceries. Her mother had already delayed one prescription refill until payday. Annie knew there was no emergency savings account waiting for them. There was only Friday. Richard rested one hand on the acquisition papers. "If she ran out of your department, why would you think an intern would come all the way up here and hide in my office?" Gregory's expression changed almost imperceptibly, but Richard saw it. "I'm checking every possibility." Richard's voice remained calm, yet the room seemed to grow colder. "Are you underestimating me, Gregory? Or do you think I'm afraid to question you?" Gregory straightened. "Neither. I'm trying to protect the company and the transaction, then go downstairs and protect them there." Richard glanced at the documents in front of him before looking back at Gregory. "If the girl is in this office, I'll fire her myself. What I don't need is my chief legal officer wandering around the executive floor personally hunting for an intern when we have a $3 billion transaction approaching closing." Gregory opened his mouth as though he wanted to argue, then stopped himself. "Understood." He gave a slight nod, but suspicion remained in his eyes as he looked around the office one final time. Then he left. The door closed. Silence filled the room. 1 minute passed, then another. Richard lightly tapped one finger against his desk before finally speaking. "Come out, Annie, and you'd better give me a very good reason not to have you escorted out of this building." For several seconds, Annie remained beneath the desk, too tense to move. Then she slowly crawled out and stood, smoothing her clothes with shaking hands. Richard noticed the trembling. He also noticed how hard she was trying to hide it. The irritation he had felt when she first burst into his office was gone now. He looked once toward the locked door Gregory had just walked through, then turned back to the 18-year-old standing in front of him. "Now," he said, his voice lower and more serious than before, "tell me why my chief legal officer had to personally chase you through my building." Annie swallowed and forced herself to meet Richard's eyes. When Mr. Hale came into the records room, he didn't shout at first. He just looked at the screen, then at me, and told me I was in the wrong folder. Richard remained behind his desk. "Were you?" "No, sir. The folder was part of my assignment. I was checking file names, dates, and version numbers before the final Northbridge package went upstairs. I didn't search for anything outside the system. And the 2 disclosure schedules? They had almost the same name. One was marked final. The other had an older version number. I opened both because I thought somebody had duplicated a file by mistake." Annie took out her phone but kept it in her hand. Most of the pages matched. Then I reached the liabilities section. Richard said nothing, which made her continue. The older schedule listed environmental claims, 2 land disputes, and several settlement reserves. The final version didn't. Those lines were gone. Richard's eyes narrowed. Gone entirely? Yes. How much are we talking about? I don't know. I didn't have time to add everything. Then don't guess. I'm not. Richard studied her for another moment. Good. Keep going. Annie looked down at her phone. There was another line farther down. Arden Strategic Advisory. It said, Success Advisory Payment upon transaction completion. The amount was $18.7 million. Richard's face did not change, but Annie noticed his fingers stop moving against the edge of the desk. Show me. She unlocked her phone and stepped closer. Her hand was still trembling when she turned the screen toward him. The photograph was slightly tilted because she had taken it quickly, but the text was clear enough. Richard enlarged the image with 2 fingers and read it once. Then again. Arden Strategic Advisory. Success Advisory Payment upon transaction completion. 10.71 million. His gaze remained on the screen. Who approved this? I don't know. Was there a signature? Not on that page. Richard scrolled back to the full image. And you're certain this was part of the Northbridge closing file? Yes, the file path is at the top. He enlarged that section too. Annie watched his expression become more focused. You recognize something? I recognize what isn't there. Richard handed the phone back. I've reviewed every material transaction fee connected to this acquisition. I have never seen Arden Strategic Advisory. Annie let out a breath she had been holding. Richard immediately looked at her. That doesn't mean you're right about everything else. Her relief disappeared. I didn't say it did. No. But I need you to understand something. A photograph of 1 page does not prove fraud, and it certainly doesn't prove Gregory falsified anything. There may be an explanation. Annie nodded, though disappointment showed on her face. I understand. Do you? Yes, sir. But if there's an explanation, why did he try to take my phone? Richard folded his arms. That was the question he had been asking himself since Gregory left. Tell me exactly how that happened. Annie took a breath. After I asked why the liabilities were missing from the final version, Mr. Hale told me there were different drafts for different purposes. I asked whether the board had seen the version with the liabilities. He looked at me differently after that. How? Like I had stopped being an intern and become a problem. Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He told me to close the file and delete the picture. I asked him why. He said the materials were privileged and that I could damage the transaction if I misunderstood them. That part is plausible. I know. So I told him I would delete it if my supervisor confirmed I had opened something I wasn't authorized to see. Richard raised an eyebrow. You told Gregory Hale that? Annie gave a nervous nod. Probably not the smartest thing I've ever done. Despite himself, Richard almost smiled. What happened next? He held out his hand and told me to give him my phone. I said it was my personal phone. He said company confidentiality rules gave him the authority to secure anything containing privileged information. Then he stepped between me and the door. Richard's expression changed. Did he touch you? No. Did he threaten you? Not directly. What did he say? Annie hesitated. He said, think carefully about whether you want one foolish decision to follow you into college. If you feel for Annie right now, an 18-year-old intern being pressured simply because she asked the wrong person the right question, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because you never know, someone near you may be watching Annie's story right along with you. Richard stared at her. He said that exactly? Yes. And then? I told him I wanted my supervisor present. He reached for the phone. I moved back. He told me not to make things worse for myself. Annie looked toward the door. When somebody came into the hallway, I ran. Richard walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Atlanta. Traffic moved far below. Ordinary and distant. While inside his office, a transaction that had consumed nearly 2 years was beginning to look less ordinary by the minute. Why come here? He asked without turning around. There are security desks on nearly every floor. Annie gave a small, humorless laugh. Security works for the company. So do I. Yes, but you own it. Richard turned. Annie realized how that sounded. I mean, if Mr. Hale really was doing something wrong, I figured there was only one person in the building he couldn't order around. Richard looked at her for several seconds. That may be the first sensible thing you've said since you came through my door. I'll take it. This time he did smile, but it vanished quickly. He returned to his desk and picked up the phone. Annie stiffened. Who are you calling? My executive assistant. For security? No. Richard pressed a button. Margaret, delay the Northbridge closing. A pause followed. Even Annie could hear the confusion in the woman's voice through the receiver. Mr. Whitmore, the board is already assembling. And Northbridge's counsel. I know where everyone is. Move the closing. For how long? Until I say otherwise. Another pause. Yes, sir. Richard ended the call. Annie stared at him. You just delayed a $3 billion deal because of what I showed you? Richard looked back at the photograph on her phone. No. Her expression fell. He continued. I delayed it because I don't yet know whether what you showed me is a misunderstanding or the beginning of something much worse. Signing before I know would be negligence. He reached for another phone line. Sit down, Annie. She remained standing. Do you believe me? Richard paused before answering. I believe Gregory gave me a reason to ask questions. You gave me a reason to start looking. He dialed. That is not the same as believing either of you. Annie slowly sat in the chair across from him. Richard waited for the call to connect, his eyes returning once more to the number on her screen. $18,700,000. For the first time that morning, the Northbridge deal no longer looked like the biggest problem in the building. The bigger problem was finding out who had put that number there and why someone had tried so hard to make sure an 18-year-old intern never asked about it. Richard's next call went to a woman named Elaine Foster, the director of internal audit, who had worked for Whitmore Capital long enough to know that when Richard used her direct number instead of going through an assistant, he expected discretion. Elaine, I need you upstairs, he said. Bring no one from legal. I also want someone from IT who can preserve server activity without notifying the department involved. There was a brief silence on the line. Is this related to Northbridge? It may be. Until we know, assume nothing and discuss it with no one. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Richard ended the call, then looked at Annie, who was still sitting across from him with her phone held tightly between both hands. You're going to stay here until we determine what happened to that file. Annie shifted in the chair. Am I allowed to call my mother? The question caught him off guard. Why wouldn't you be? She expects me to answer around this time. I usually text her after I get settled at work. Annie glanced at the clock. If I don't, she'll think something happened on Marta. Richard nodded toward her phone. Call her. Just don't discuss Northbridge, Gregory, or anything you saw. Annie moved toward the windows before dialing. Her mother answered after the second ring. Hey, baby. You made it in? Yes, ma'am. You sound out of breath. Annie looked briefly toward Richard. It's been a strange morning. What kind of strange? The kind I can't explain yet. There was a pause, followed by the voice of a woman who had raised a daughter long enough to know when pressing harder would only make her worry more. All right. Are you safe? Annie glanced at the locked office door. Yes. Then eat something when you get a chance. You left your apple on the kitchen counter again. Despite everything, Annie smiled. I know. And don't buy one of those $8 sandwiches downtown just because you forgot it. I packed lunch. Good. Call me later. I will. Love you. Love you too. When Annie ended the call, Richard was looking at the papers on his desk. But she had the uncomfortable feeling he had heard most of the conversation. My mother worries, she said. That's generally what mothers do. Annie slipped the phone into her bag. Do billionaires still get calls reminding them to eat lunch? Richard looked up. Not since my mother died. The answer was so matter-of-fact that Annie immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't know. That was all he said, but something in the room changed. For the first time, Annie saw something other than the man whose photograph appeared in business magazines and on the company website. He was still intimidating, still capable of making an entire floor nervous by walking through it, but he was also a 50-year-old man who had once had a mother calling to make sure he ate. A knock came at the door. Annie stiffened instantly. Richard noticed. Relax. If it were Gregory, he wouldn't knock that politely. He unlocked the door himself. Elaine Foster entered first, a woman in her late 50s with silver beginning to show through her dark hair. Behind her was a younger man carrying a laptop. Elaine looked from Richard to Annie but asked no questions. "This is Marcus Lee from Infrastructure Security," she said. "He can preserve system logs without touching legal's active environment." Richard closed the door again. "Good. Annie, tell them exactly where you found the files." For the next 20 minutes, Annie repeated the path through the Northbridge document system. She did not speculate. When she could not remember something, she said so. When Marcus asked whether she had clicked through a restricted link, she shook her head. "No, everything I opened was already inside the folder assigned to me." "What was your assignment?" Elaine asked. "Checking file names against the index, confirming dates, and flagging duplicate versions before the closing package was finalized." Elaine looked at Richard. That would give her access to document metadata and the schedules stored in the review folder. So she didn't break into anything. Not from what she's describing. Marcus turned his laptop toward them. "I'll need her employee ID." Annie handed him her badge. The white plastic card looked almost childish sitting beside Richard's acquisition agreement. Annie Carter, Legal Operations Intern. Marcus entered the number and began checking access records. While he worked, Annie stared at her badge. 7 weeks earlier, getting it had felt like entering another world. She had arrived 20 minutes early on her first day because Denise had raised her to believe being late told people you considered your time more important than theirs. Annie had taken the train downtown in a navy skirt her mother had pressed the night before, carrying a turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a bag of chips because buying lunch near Whitmore Tower every day would have consumed too much of her paycheck. The internship had come through a college readiness program at her high school. Most of the other students placed in corporate offices talked about networking and resume building. Annie had thought about those things too. She had also calculated what 12 weeks of pay could cover. 2 electric bills, her community college enrollment deposit, several of her mother's prescription co-pays. That was why Gregory's threat had frightened her more than she wanted Richard to understand. For people on the executive floor, losing a job might mean calling a recruiter. In Annie's house, losing a paycheck meant deciding which bill could wait. Marcus suddenly leaned closer to his screen. "I found her session." Richard came around the desk. "What does it show?" She logged in at 7:51, accessed the Northbridge review directory at 8:03, opened 2 files at 8:08 and 8:10. He looked at Annie. "That fit what you remember?" "Yes." "Any unauthorized access?" Marcus shook his head. "Not that I can see. Her permissions were valid." Annie exhaled quietly. Richard did not celebrate. "What happened after she opened the second document?" Marcus typed several commands. "I'm tracing that now." Elaine turned to Annie. "How long have you worked here?" 7 weeks. "You've had any disciplinary issues?" "No, Mom." "Warnings?" "No." Richard noticed the ma'am. Annie had used it automatically, the same way she called him sir. It was not submission. It was upbringing. Elaine asked, "And nobody told you that the folder was outside your assignment before this morning?" "No." Marcus stopped typing. His expression changed. Richard saw it immediately. "What?" "There's a deletion event." "When?" Marcus enlarged the log. The document Annie accessed at 8:10 was removed at 8:17. Annie stared at the screen. 7 minutes. Richard's voice became very quiet. "Who deleted it?" "I don't know yet. The action came through an administrator account assigned to legal operations. I'll have to trace the credentials." Elaine folded her arms. "Could it be routine cleanup?" At 8:17 on closing morning, 7 minutes after an intern opened it? Marcus shook his head. "Possible. I wouldn't call it routine." Richard looked at Annie. For the first time since she had burst into his office, she saw something in his face that looked less like suspicion and more like calculation. He picked up her internship badge from the table and handed it back. "Keep this with you." Annie took it. "Am I still an employee?" Richard held her gaze. "Until somebody shows me a legitimate reason you shouldn't be." Marcus turned the laptop back toward himself. "There's something else. I can preserve the deleted file reference, but if someone with administrator access realizes we're looking, they may start cleaning other records." Richard's expression hardened. "Then preserve everything before they know." Elaine nodded and reached for her phone. Richard stopped her with one sentence. "And Elaine?" She looked up. "No one from Gregory Hale's department touches this review." Annie felt the weight of those words. The investigation was no longer about whether an 18-year-old intern had wandered into the wrong folder. 7 minutes after she had seen something she was never supposed to question, someone with legal department authority had tried to make it disappear. Marcus began preserving the legal department's server activity, while Elaine stepped into the adjoining conference room to call the outside counsel Richard trusted for sensitive internal matters. Annie stayed near the window, her badge clipped back onto her blouse, but it no longer felt like proof that she belonged in the building. It felt more like evidence that she had been present when something went wrong. Richard remained behind his desk, reading the first audit notes as they appeared on Marcus's screen. "Show me her access path again." Marcus rotated the laptop. She entered through the review directory assigned to her team, opened the index, then 2 schedules. No elevated permissions, no restricted folder breach, no credential switching. Richard looked at Annie. "So you didn't go looking for trouble?" "No, sir." "Then why didn't you just close the second file when you realized the numbers were different?" Annie hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she knew how simple it would sound in a room where people made decisions involving billions of dollars. Because if 2 numbers are supposed to match and they don't, one of them is wrong. Richard's expression barely changed. Annie continued. "My mother taught me that with bills. If the hospital says we owe one amount and the insurance company says another, you don't just pay whichever one is easier. You figure out why they're different." For the first time, Marcus looked up from the laptop. Richard asked, "And that was enough for you to keep reading?" "It was enough for me to ask a question." Before Richard could respond, Elaine returned carrying a yellow legal pad. "Outside counsel is available. They're setting up a separate evidence hold now. We'll keep the review independent from Gregory's team." Richard nodded. "Good. I want a complete record of who accessed the Northbridge schedules over the last 30 days. Elaine glanced toward Annie. "Including her?" "Including everyone." Annie appreciated that more than she expected. Richard was not protecting her by pretending she could do no wrong. He was making sure the same rules applied to everyone in the room. Marcus typed for another minute, then frowned. "There's another issue." Richard moved closer. "What?" The administrator account that deleted the file didn't just remove the document. It also cleared the local version history. Elaine's eyebrows rose. "That's not standard housekeeping." "No. Normal cleanup preserves version history for retention. Whoever did this used a higher-level delete function." Richard's voice became colder. "Can you identify the user?" "Not yet. The account belongs to Legal Operations Administration, but several senior users have delegated access." Richard looked toward the locked door. "Gregory? He would have access," Marcus said. "So would 2 deputies and 1 systems administrator. That means we don't have proof it was him." "No." Richard's attention shifted to Annie. "You understand that?" "Yes." "Good. I don't want you turning suspicion into certainty just because he frightened you." Annie bristled, but she kept her tone controlled. "I'm not. I'm telling you what I saw. And I'm telling you that what you saw has to survive people who will spend a great deal of money explaining it away." Annie held his gaze. "Then we should make sure they can't." Something in Richard's face softened for half a second. A knock sounded at the door. Everyone stopped. Richard glanced at Marcus. "Can he see what you're doing from the hallway?" "No." Richard unlocked the door but opened it only partway. His executive assistant, Margaret Ellis, stood outside holding a folder. She was in her early 60s, with the composed expression of someone who had spent decades managing powerful people without being impressed by them. "I thought you should see this before the board starts calling you directly." She handed Richard the folder. "What is it?" "An incident report from legal. It was filed 17 minutes ago." Richard opened it. Annie watched his eyes move down the page. "What does it say?" she asked. Richard did not answer immediately. Elaine stepped closer. "Who filed it?" "Gregory." That was enough to make Annie's stomach tighten again. Richard read several lines aloud. "Legal Operations Intern Annie Carter accessed privileged acquisition materials beyond the intended scope of her assignment, photographed confidential documents, became agitated when questioned, and refused instructions to preserve company property." Annie stared at him. "That's not what happened." Richard lifted one hand. "I know what you told me. He's making it sound like I broke into something." Margaret looked at Annie, not unkindly. "That is what the wording is designed to suggest." Richard continued reading. "Given Miss Carter's age and apparent distress, I recommend the company avoid immediate law enforcement involvement and instead pursue an internal resolution." Annie gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Now he's protecting me?" Elaine shook her head. "No. He's building a record that says he was reasonable, and you were unstable. Annie looked from Elaine to Richard. So if I tell anyone he chased me, he gets to say I panicked. Richard closed the folder. That is one interpretation. It's the interpretation he wants. Yes. The answer was so direct that Annie fell silent. Richard placed the report beside the acquisition agreement. 2 documents now sat next to each other, one connected to a $3.2 billion transaction, the other describing an 18-year-old intern as a problem to be managed. He looked at Margaret. When was this report created? Timestamp says 8:36. Richard checked the clock. Then he looked at Annie. Gregory was in this office before 8:30. Marcus immediately understood. So he didn't file the incident report until after he came up here looking for her. Elaine's eyes narrowed. Meaning the documentation came after the search, not before it. Richard nodded slowly. If he genuinely believed she had committed a serious security violation, the report should have existed before he left legal operations. Annie felt something shift inside her. It was not relief. Not yet. But for the first time, Gregory's title was no longer the only thing in the room carrying weight. Richard looked at her. There's a lesson in this, Annie. She waited. A title can make a lie travel faster. He tapped the incident report with one finger. It does not make the lie true. Marcus turned the laptop around again. I may have something. Everyone gathered closer. A recovery window had appeared on the screen. Most of the deleted document was corrupted, but several lines of text remained visible. One of them read, Arden Strategic Advisory. Annie leaned forward. That's it. Richard's eyes stayed on the screen. Below the company name, fragments of a payment schedule were beginning to load. The file had not disappeared completely, and whoever had deleted it had just lost the advantage of pretending it had never existed. The recovered fragment was incomplete, but it was enough to change the room. Marcus saved an image of the recovered lines, duplicated the evidence to the protected server Elaine had created, then disconnected his laptop from the legal department's active environment. Richard watched the process without speaking. Annie remained beside the desk, staring at the words Arden Strategic Advisory, as if seeing them again made the morning more real. Elaine broke the silence first. We have enough now to justify a full forensic recovery, but not enough to make accusations. I want the original server image preserved before anyone starts digging deeper. Richard nodded. Do it, and keep the circle small. I already have outside counsel preparing the hold. Marcus gathered his equipment and followed Elaine into the adjoining room. Margaret left a moment later to deal with the growing list of executives demanding to know why the Northbridge closing had been pushed back. When the door closed, Annie and Richard were alone again. For several seconds, Annie said nothing. She kept looking at the int. Gregory had filed, then finally asked the question that had been following her since she crawled out from under Richard's desk. Am I fired? Richard looked up. The question seemed to surprise him more than anything she had said that morning. Why would you assume that? Annie gave him a look that made the answer obvious. Because I photographed confidential documents, ran out of the legal department, came up 20 floors, locked myself inside the CEO's office, and hid under his desk. When you put it that way, it has been an unusual morning. She almost smiled, but the worry remained. I'm serious. Sueni. Richard closed the incident report and placed it aside. Until this review establishes what happened, you're still an employee. Does that mean I keep getting paid? Now he understood what she was actually asking. Yes. Annie exhaled, but Richard noticed how quickly she tried to disguise the relief. That matters a great deal to you. It matters to most people who work for a paycheck. The answer came out sharper than she intended. Annie lowered her eyes. Sorry. Don't apologize for an accurate statement. She hesitated, then decided there was little point hiding the truth from a man who already knew more about her morning than anyone else. My mom works in a public school cafeteria. She has lupus, so there are weeks when she can't work all her hours. Her insurance covers some things, but there are copays, prescriptions, lab work. Annie rubbed her thumb against the edge of her badge. This internship helps. How much? She looked at him. How much does what help? How much of the household expense are you covering? Annie's expression tightened with embarrassment. I'm not asking you for money. I didn't suggest that you were. She studied him for a moment before answering. Some groceries. Part of the electric bill. Gas when my mother's car actually decides to start. I paid my community college enrollment deposit myself. Richard nodded once. Annie continued, quieter now. Last night she was separating her pills into one of those plastic boxes with the days on top. She said one refill could wait until Friday. Friday is payday. Richard leaned back in his chair. So when Gregory threatened your future, you weren't thinking about a recommendation letter. That too. Annie gave a tired little shrug. But mostly I was thinking about what happens if my check doesn't come. Richard was silent for several seconds. Then he said, your pay continues while this investigation is active. Whatever else we discover, an 18-year-old employee is not going to lose her income simply because a 47-year-old executive got to write the first version of the story. Annie looked at him carefully. You still don't know if I'm right. No. Then why do that? Because suspension without facts would make Gregory's accusation the punishment before the investigation even begins. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than reassurance would have. Richard turned toward the window. Far below, traffic moved along Peachtree Street while the city continued with a morning that had no idea a multi-billion-dollar transaction had been stopped inside the tower above it. Something Annie had said brought back a memory he had not thought about in years. When I was 17, I worked evenings at a hardware store outside Marietta, he said. Annie looked surprised. You? Yes, Annie. Billionaires are occasionally born before the money arrives. That earned a genuine smile. Richard continued. Inventory started disappearing. Power tools mostly. The owner blamed a girl who worked weekends. She was 17 too. New employee, no family connection to anyone there. Easiest person to suspect. What happened? She got fired. 2 months later, they caught an assistant manager selling merchandise out the back. Annie's smile disappeared. Did she get her job back? I don't know. You never found out? No. Richard stared out the window, and the answer seemed to bother him now in a way it had not at 17. At the time, I thought the lesson was that the owner should have investigated better. I'm beginning to think there was another lesson. What? That everyone else in the store watched it happen because believing the manager was easier than defending the girl. Annie was quiet. Richard turned back toward her. People trust titles because titles save them the trouble of deciding for themselves. She glanced at Gregory's report. And sometimes the person with the title knows that. Yes. Annie walked closer to the desk, stopping beside the stack of Northbridge documents that had consumed nearly 2 years of Richard's life. Can I ask you something? You haven't been particularly shy so far. How could this happen inside your company without you knowing? Richard's face hardened slightly. This company has more than 12,000 employees. I don't personally review every legal schedule, every compliance document, or every invoice. I know. Then what exactly are you asking? Annie chose her words carefully. Something important enough for Mr. Hale to chase me through the building was sitting inside a deal you were about to sign. How did nobody bring it to you? Richard answered with the confidence of a man who had used the same explanation for years. Because I employ people to know. Annie held his gaze. Then, almost apologetically, she said, maybe that's the problem. The words landed harder than she expected. Richard's jaw tightened. Explain. You trust people to tell you what matters. That makes sense. Annie glanced around the office, at the skyline, the polished furniture, the acquisition agreement. But if the people deciding what you need to know are also the people who benefit from you not knowing it, then being at the top doesn't mean you see everything. It might mean you see less. Richard did not answer. A knock saved Annie from wondering whether she had finally gone too far. Elaine entered carrying several printed pages, Marcus behind her. We recovered more of the payment schedule. Richard immediately stood. How much? Elaine placed the pages on his desk. The Arden payment is real, but it isn't isolated. Richard scanned the figures. Marcus pointed to several lines. We found recurring consulting fees, settlement reserves, and advisory payments routed through multiple entities. Some are tied to Northbridge, some go back several years. Richard looked at the total at the bottom of the reconstructed sheet. Annie leaned closer. The number was just over $64 million. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Richard looked at Annie. The question was no longer whether she had misunderstood one suspicious payment. The question was how much of his company had been built around information someone had decided he did not need to see. The $64 million total sat at the bottom of the reconstructed schedule. But Richard did not look at it first. His attention moved line by line through the entities above it, tracing the dates, descriptions, and approval codes the way a man reads damage reports after realizing the problem began long before anyone sounded an alarm. "Which of these are Northbridge?" he asked. Marcus pointed to the highlighted rows. "These 12. The others are older, but the formatting is similar enough that we flagged them for comparison." Elaine placed another sheet beside the first. Some of the shell entities share registered agent addresses. A few invoices use nearly identical wording, even though they supposedly came from unrelated consulting firms. Richard's eyes narrowed. "That is not proof of fraud." "No," Elaine said. "It is proof we need to keep looking." Annie stood at the edge of the desk, careful not to lean too far over the documents. She recognized one of the addresses before anyone else said anything. "That one?" Marcus looked up. "What about it?" Annie pointed. "I've seen it before." Richard turned toward her. "Where?" "In expense reconciliation. Last week, maybe the week before." She frowned, searching her memory. "There was a legal services invoice with that same suite number. Different company name." Elaine studied her. "You're sure?" "I think so." Richard's expression tightened. "Thinking and knowing are different." "I know." Annie looked back at the page. "Give me a second." She closed her eyes briefly, not dramatically, just trying to recreate the spreadsheet she had handled days earlier. The number had stood out because the street name reminded her of the church her mother used to attend. 347 Paces Ferry Road, she said. Suite 800. Marcus checked the record. "That's it." Elaine looked impressed despite herself. "What was the company?" Annie shook her head. "I don't remember. Something with advisory or partners. I only noticed the address because I had to correct the zip code." Richard looked at Marcus. "Find every vendor tied to that address." "I'm already on it." Annie stepped back, suddenly conscious of how many senior people were now listening to her. She did not understand securities law, acquisition structure, or the deeper accounting treatment behind what they were seeing. What she did understand was repetition. She had spent 7 weeks cleaning up other people's file names and checking numbers they considered too boring to review themselves. Now the boring details were talking. Elaine tapped the spreadsheet. "If these entities are connected, the next question is who authorized them." Marcus filtered the recovered metadata. There are initials attached to several entries. Richard leaned closer. "GH," Marcus said. Nobody needed that explained. Then he scrolled further. "And MV." Richard's face changed. Annie noticed immediately. "You know who that is?" "Yes." "Who?" Richard took the page from Marcus and looked at the initials again, as if hoping they might rearrange themselves into something else. "Martin Voss." Annie waited. Elaine supplied the rest. "Chairman of Northbridge Holdings." The room went quiet. Annie looked back at the spreadsheet. "So Mr. Hale and the chairman of the company you're buying are both connected to these payments?" "We do not know that yet," Richard said. "But their initials are there." "The initials are there. That tells us what to investigate. It does not tell us what conclusion to reach." Annie nodded, though she could hear how carefully he was choosing every word now. A soft knock came at the door. Margaret entered carrying a tablet. "Richard, the board wants a conference call in 15 minutes. Northbridge is asking whether the delay is financing related, and 2 banks are threatening to move their availability windows if they don't get an answer before noon." Richard did not even look at her. "Tell them the closing remains delayed." Margaret hesitated. "They're going to ask why." "Tell them I'm reviewing a material internal issue." That phrase will make them panic. "It should." Margaret gave one small nod and left. Annie looked at Richard. "How much does delaying something like this cost?" "Potentially a great deal. Millions, depending on how long this lasts." She glanced at the $64 million figure. "And you're still going to keep it delayed?" Richard turned toward her. "If there is a legitimate explanation, we will find it. If there isn't, I would rather lose money before signing than lose more after." Before Annie could answer, another executive entered with Elaine's permission. His name was Daniel Mercer, Whitmore's chief financial officer, a man in his early 60s with reading glasses hanging from one hand and irritation already visible on his face. "I just got off the phone with Wells and 2 members of the board. Elaine tells me we're holding the deal because an intern photographed a draft schedule." Annie felt the sentence more than she expected. An intern, not Annie Carter, not witness, not employee, just the smallest title in the room. Richard's voice remained even. "We're holding the deal because the draft appears to contain material information absent from the board package." Daniel looked at Annie, then back at Richard. And we're certain she understood what she was looking at? Annie opened her mouth. Richard spoke first. Have you reviewed the recovered schedule? Daniel frowned. Not yet. Then at this moment, she has looked at more evidence than you have. The CFO went silent. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Elaine slid the reconstructed pages across the table. Read these before you form an opinion. Daniel took them, his expression changing as he moved through the entries. Annie watched him reach the total. 64 million? Just over, Elaine said. He lowered the pages. This cannot all be Northbridge. It isn't, Marcus said. That's part of the problem. Daniel looked at Richard. If these older payments touched Whitmore entities, we may have disclosure exposure beyond the acquisition. I know. And if Gregory is involved? I know. Richard's patience thinned. Daniel stopped. Marcus turned his laptop again. I found 3 companies registered through the same address, Annie remembered. Different names, same agent, same suite. 2 appear in older Whitmore projects. 1 appears in Northbridge. Elaine asked, who approved the Whitmore side payments? Marcus stared at the screen. GH, on both. Annie looked toward Richard. His face did not show shock anymore. It showed something heavier. Betrayal was beginning to replace suspicion. For 15 years, Gregory Hale had not been some distant attorney buried inside legal operations. He had sat across from Richard in boardrooms, traveled with him to closings, defended the company through lawsuits, and advised him through expansions that had changed the scale of Whitmore Capital. Richard had trusted him enough to stop checking. Annie remembered what she had told him earlier. Maybe that's the problem. She did not repeat it. She did not need to. Marcus continued scrolling, then suddenly stopped. There's another field attached to the MV entries. Richard stepped closer. What field? A reference code. To what? Marcus opened the linked metadata. His expression tightened. It says side letter. Daniel looked up sharply. There is no side letter in the board package. Richard's eyes moved to the Northbridge agreement still sitting on his desk. Find it. Marcus typed again. After several seconds, he shook his head. It's not in the active repository. Elaine asked. Deleted? Maybe. Or never uploaded. Richard looked at the acquisition documents that had occupied nearly every hour of his life for 2 years. A missing disclosure was one problem. $64 million in questionable payments was another. But a side agreement between his chief legal officer and the chairman of the company he was about to buy could change the meaning of the entire transaction. Richard closed the acquisition binder. Then we're done assuming this is an accounting mistake. Annie felt the room tighten around that sentence. The investigation had just become something larger than Gregory chasing an intern through a hallway. Now they had to find out whether the $3.2 billion deal had been built around a document someone had made sure Richard Whitmore never saw. Richard did not reopen the acquisition binder. For nearly 2 years, the thick black folder had been carried into conference rooms, private flights, dinners with bankers, and early morning strategy meetings. That morning it remained closed on his desk, while everyone in the room focused instead on a missing document that might explain why $64 million had moved through companies no one could properly account for. Daniel Mercer removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. If a side letter exists and the board never saw it, we have a governance problem before we even get to fraud. We have a problem only after we establish what it says, Richard replied. And if we don't find it before Northbridge walks? Richard looked at him. Then Northbridge walks. Daniel stared at him for a moment. You spent 2 years on this acquisition. I'm aware. We've committed financing, advisory fees, integration teams. People have reorganized entire divisions around this closing. And none of that makes a bad transaction better. Daniel lowered his voice. I'm not telling you to ignore evidence. I'm telling you there is a difference between investigating a concern and blowing up a deal before we know what we have. Richard's expression did not change. That is why the deal is delayed, not canceled. Annie stood near the end of the table, listening to 2 men discuss sums of money large enough to sound unreal. What felt more real was the way Daniel had looked at her when he first entered, as though she were the accidental cause of the problem rather than the person who had pointed at it. Marcus broke the tension. I can search archived mailboxes for references to the side letter code, but it will take time. If Gregory or anyone in legal notices unusual access requests, they'll know we're looking. Elaine answered before Richard could. Then don't search through legal's live environment. Pull from preserved backups. That slows us down. It also keeps the evidence clean. Richard nodded. Do it her way. Marcus gathered his laptop and moved toward the adjoining conference room. Daniel looked at Annie again. Does she need to remain in here? The question was reasonable. The tone was not. Annie felt it immediately. Richard did too. Why? Daniel seemed surprised by the challenge. Because we are discussing sensitive internal financial matters. She found the first one. That doesn't give an intern access to the rest. No, Richard said. I do. Daniel went quiet. Richard continued, still calm. If there is something she is not authorized to hear, say so specifically. Don't use her title as a substitute for an argument. Annie lowered her eyes for a second, not because she was embarrassed, but because she did not want Daniel to see how much the sentence affected her. Daniel replaced his glasses. Fine. But if this turns into litigation, every person in this room becomes part of the record. Elaine answered. That is why outside counsel is already involved. Before Daniel could respond, Margaret appeared at the door. Richard, Northbridge Council has called 3 times. Martin Voss wants to speak to you personally. Richard checked the time. It was 11:18. What does he want? He says he needs to understand whether the delay is financial, regulatory, or internal. He also says their board will reconsider the transaction if they don't receive a satisfactory explanation before noon. Daniel muttered, There it is. Richard ignored him. Tell Voss I'll call when I have something to say. Margaret hesitated. He specifically asked whether Gregory was with you. That changed the room. Elaine looked at Richard. Daniel stopped moving entirely. Annie noticed Richard's hand tighten slightly against the desk. Did he say why? No. Then don't answer the question. Margaret nodded and left. Annie waited until the door closed. Would Mr. Voss normally ask where Mr. Hale is? Richard looked at her. Not on closing morning. He would call Gregory directly. So why ask you? That, Richard said, is another question we don't answer before we have evidence. His phone rang almost immediately. The display showed Gregory Hale. Everyone saw it. Richard let it ring twice before answering. Gregory. Annie could not hear the other side clearly, but she heard the smooth cadence of Gregory's voice. Richard listened for several seconds. No, the delay is not financing, related. Another pause. I'm reviewing an internal matter. Gregory spoke longer this time. Richard's eyes moved briefly toward Annie. No, I do not need legal operations to conduct the review. Gregory's voice sharpened enough that Annie could hear the change even without understanding the words. Richard leaned back. You sound concerned. A pause. Then Gregory spoke more carefully. Richard replied, If there is something in the Northbridge files I need to know, this would be an excellent time to tell me. Annie held her breath. Gregory answered. Richard's expression remained unreadable. All right, he said. Continue preparing for closing. I'll contact you when I'm ready. He ended the call. Daniel stared at him. What did he say? That there are no undisclosed material liabilities, no unauthorized advisory arrangements, and nothing in the transaction that has not been properly reviewed. Elaine glanced at the recovered schedule. That's a fairly comprehensive denial. Yes. Annie spoke quietly. Did you mention Arden? No. The side letter? No. She understood immediately. Gregory had just volunteered certainty about things Richard had not asked him specifically. Before anyone could discuss it further, Annie's phone vibrated inside her bag. She pulled it out. An email notification. From Human Resources. Subject, Temporary Access Suspension. Her stomach dropped. Richard noticed. What is it? Annie handed him the phone. The message stated that her company system's access had been suspended pending review of an alleged confidentiality violation. She was instructed not to enter restricted work areas and to await further direction from Human Resources. Daniel exhaled. That may actually be standard procedure. Elaine shook her head. Not without the investigating manager approving it. Richard looked at Margaret's empty doorway, then called HR himself. This is Whitmore. Who authorized the suspension of Annie Carter's account? He listened. His face hardened. On whose recommendation? Another pause. Gregory Hale is not managing this investigation. Richard's tone grew colder. Restore her employment status. Preserve the account exactly as it existed this morning, but do not grant new system access until internal audit completes the review. And no one takes disciplinary action against her without my authorization or Elaine Foster's. He hung up. Annie looked at him. So I can't log in? No. Your account is evidence now. Preserving it protects you as much as the company. She nodded. Richard handed the phone back. You're still employed. Annie tried to smile. That sentence keeps having a surprisingly short life. Even Elaine laughed softly. Richard almost did, but Marcus re-entered before the moment could settle. I found a reference to the side letter. Everyone turned. Where? Archived calendar metadata. Gregory scheduled a private document review with Martin Voss 6 weeks ago. No assistance, no deal team. Richard's eyes narrowed. Location? Northbridge's executive suite. Anything else? Marcus held up a printed page. The meeting title was deleted later, but the archive retained it. He placed the page on the desk. Richard read the line. Side letter final terms. Annie felt the room change again. They still did not know what the missing letter said, but one thing was becoming difficult to dismiss. Gregory Hale and Martin Voss had discussed final terms outside the normal deal process, and someone had later tried to erase the record of that meeting. Richard looked at Elaine. Find the letter. Then he turned toward Annie. And until we do, you do not leave this floor alone. Annie's expression tightened. Because you think Gregory might come after me again? Richard looked toward the closed office door. No, he said quietly, because now he knows I'm not taking his word for it. The reference to the side letter gave them something concrete to chase, but not yet something they could use. A deleted meeting title proved Gregory and Martin Voss had discussed final terms outside the normal deal process. It did not prove what those terms were, why they had been hidden, or whether the missing document had ever been signed. Elaine took the printed calendar record and read it twice. If they reviewed a final side letter 6 weeks ago, there should be traces somewhere. Draft attachments, printing logs, document, management records, even calendar invites sent and recalled. Marcus nodded. I can search the archived backups, but if it never went through Whitmore systems, we may not find the document itself. Richard looked toward the closed acquisition binder. Then find the footprint. People think deleting a document removes the event. It usually removes only the easiest part to see. Annie remained near the window while the others worked. For the first time since she had run into Richard's office, no one was asking her questions, which gave her enough silence to think. She kept returning to one detail from the spreadsheet, the dates. She remembered seeing them beside the initials G, H, and MV. But at the time, she had been focused on the dollar amounts. Can I see the recovered schedule again? Elaine handed it to her. Don't make notes on the original printout. I won't. Annie scanned the lines slowly. There it was, halfway down the page. Beside one of the MV entries, a shortened date code. She frowned. What? Richard asked. This date. I remember it from the screen downstairs. Marcus leaned over. Tomorrow. Richard's eyes shifted to him. You're sure? Month, day, year, yes. Annie pointed to another column, and this code next to it was there too. Elaine read it. Completion adjustment. Daniel, who had been standing near the conference table with his phone in his hand, looked up. That could mean almost anything in an acquisition. Could it mean a payment? Annie asked. It could mean a pricing adjustment, an escrow release, a post-closing true, up. It depends on the agreement. Richard looked at the date again. The deal was supposed to close today. Daniel nodded, which means anything scheduled for tomorrow would occur after control transfers. The implications settled over the room. Annie asked. So if there was a payment they didn't want you to see, it would happen after you owned Northbridge? Possibly, Richard said, or after the transaction became difficult to unwind. He did not like the sentence as soon as he said it. Elaine noticed. You're thinking this was structured to become our problem after closing. I'm thinking we don't know enough yet. Annie glanced at him. You say that a lot, because people get into trouble when they stop saying it. She looked back at the papers. But you know more now than you did this morning. Yes, and it keeps getting worse. Richard did not answer immediately. That silence gave her the courage to ask the question she had already asked once, only now she wanted a different answer. How did Gregory get this far? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Elaine looked down at her notes. Richard knew Annie was not asking how Gregory had moved a file or approved an invoice. She was asking how a man could spend 15 years beside him and build a system Richard had never seen. He walked toward the windows and looked down at Midtown Atlanta. For a long time, I read everything, he said. Every acquisition memo, every litigation report, every major contract. When the company had 40 employees, that was possible. At 400, it became difficult. At 4,000, it became foolish to pretend I could. Annie listened. So you trusted people. I hired people who were supposed to be better than I was at their jobs. That sounds reasonable. It was. Richard turned back toward her. Until reasonable became convenient. Daniel looked at him. Richard. No. Richard shook his head. She asked a fair question. He continued, this time without defending himself. Gregory solved problems before they reached me. He kept deals moving. He made complicated things simpler. When legal issues disappeared from my desk, I treated that as evidence that the department was working. Annie looked at the $64 million schedule. But maybe some problems disappeared because he didn't want you to see them. Yes, it was the first time Richard had said it without qualification. Elaine crossed her arms. That doesn't make you responsible for what he concealed. Richard looked at her. It makes me responsible for the system in which concealment became useful. No one answered. After a moment, he added, there are different ways to look away. Sometimes you turn your head. Sometimes you build enough floors between yourself and the people who can see the problem. Annie thought about 20 floors between legal operations and this office. That morning, the distance had felt physical. Now it felt like the entire point. Marcus interrupted from the conference table. I found something. Everyone gathered around. He had recovered a document management record from an archived backup. The file itself was gone, but the system still preserved its title, creation date, and last known owner. Side letter Northbridge, Whitmore Final. Created 6 weeks earlier. Owner, Gregory Hale. Last modified by an external guest account registered to Northbridge. Elaine pointed to the external user. Can you identify it? Marcus opened the associated profile. The name appeared on the screen. Martin Vos. Daniel swore quietly. Richard leaned closer. Any attachment history? Not yet, but there's one more thing. Marcus opened the metadata. The document was accessed 3 times after the private meeting. The last access was yesterday at 6:41 p.m. Annie felt a chill move through her. By who? Marcus read the log. Gregory. Richard's jaw tightened. Annie looked back at the date on the recovered payment schedule. Tomorrow. Gregory had opened the missing side letter less than 14 hours before Annie found the altered disclosures. Whatever arrangement he and Martin Voss had made 6 weeks ago was not an old mistake buried in paperwork. It was still active. Richard looked at Elaine. We need the document before tomorrow. Daniel glanced at the clock. We may not have until tomorrow. If Northbridge realizes how deep this review has gone, they could terminate first. Richard closed the recovered schedule and placed both hands on the table. Then let them. Daniel stared at him. You're willing to lose the deal? Richard's answer came without hesitation. I'm willing to lose a deal before I let someone use my signature to make their problem mine. Annie watched him differently after that, not because she suddenly trusted him completely, but because for the first time that day, Richard Whitmore was no longer asking what Gregory had hidden from him. He was beginning to ask what his own success had taught other people they could hide. By early afternoon, the problem was no longer contained inside Richard Whitmore's office. Someone had started talking. Margaret came in carrying her tablet and closed the door behind her. 3 board members have called in the last 20 minutes. All 3 used almost the same language. Richard looked up from the recovered metadata. What language? That you're delaying the Northbridge transaction over an allegation made by an intern. Annie felt the word before she fully understood why it bothered her. An intern, not Annie Carter. Not the employee who found the conflicting schedules. Not the person whose account logs showed she had accessed the files legitimately. Just an intern, Margaret continued. One board member said Gregory told him a young employee had become confused by an internal draft and overreacted. Richard's expression hardened. Gregory contacted the board. Apparently. Daniel Mercer let out a slow breath. He's getting ahead of the story. Elaine nodded. He knows we're investigating now. If he can make Annie look unreliable before we finish, every piece of evidence we recover becomes something he can call a misunderstanding. Annie folded her arms. So now I'm confused. No one answered immediately. She looked at Richard. This morning I was stealing documents. Then I was agitated. Now I'm confused. Which one am I supposed to be? Richard leaned back in his chair. Whichever version makes you easiest to dismiss. The answer hit harder than she expected. Annie looked toward the windows. He keeps calling me the intern. You are an intern. I know what my badge says. Richard studied her. She continued, but that's not why he's saying it. He wants people to hear 18-year-old intern before they hear anything else. Richard nodded slowly. Yes. Annie turned back toward him. Because if they think I'm too young to understand what I saw, he doesn't have to prove I'm wrong. Richard rested one hand on the table. People don't always silence you by saying you're wrong. Sometimes they silence you by deciding you're too small to matter. Annie said nothing. She had felt versions of that before, though rarely this clearly. Teachers who assumed she needed financial aid before asking about her grades. Office employees who handed her delivery packages because they assumed she was support staff. Executives who had spent 7 weeks walking past her without learning her name. None of those moments had seemed important enough to argue about. Gregory had turned the same assumption into a weapon. Margaret's phone vibrated. She read the message and looked at Richard. Northbridge is requesting a formal explanation by 2:30. They're threatening to invoke the delay provisions. Let them threaten. Daniel looked at Richard. At some point, we have to decide whether we have enough to justify this. We have deleted files, concealed payment schedules, shared addresses, $64 million in questionable entries, and metadata tying Gregory to a missing side letter with Martin Voss. We have evidence of irregularities, Daniel replied. We do not yet have proof that Gregory intended to deceive you or the board. Elaine looked toward him. He lied about Annie. He can argue he believed she violated procedure. He denied undisclosed arrangements. He can argue he was referring only to material obligations. Richard lifted one hand, ending the exchange. Daniel is right about one thing. We can show that something was hidden. We still need to establish that Gregory knew exactly what he was hiding. Annie frowned. Doesn't deleting the file prove that? Not by itself, Elaine said. The administrator account was used. Gregory can say someone else deleted it. And the side letter? We know he opened something by that name, Richard said. We don't have the document. Annie looked around the room. So he can explain everything away one piece at a time. For now, Richard said. Marcus returned from the conference room carrying 2 printed logs. I traced the registered agent addresses. The 3 shell companies Annie connected are real entities, but they have almost no operating footprint. No normal payroll, no meaningful office leases, and very limited public activity. Beneficial owners? Elaine asked. Hidden behind another LLC structure. I'm still working on it. Richard took the pages. Anything directly tying Gregory to the money? Approval codes, yes. Intent, no. That word again. Intent. Annie sat down for the first time in nearly half an hour. She thought about Gregory entering the office that morning, calm enough to make her wonder whether she had imagined the danger. She thought about how quickly he had turned her into the person under suspicion and how carefully every sentence had been chosen. He was a lawyer. Of course, he knew how much not to say. What happens if you call him in right now? She asked. Richard looked at her. He denies everything. What if you show him the recovered schedule? He says it was a working draft. The shell companies? He says legal approved vendors based on documentation provided by Finance or Northbridge. The side letter? Richard answered this one himself. He says it concerned routine transaction terms and that the final agreement superseded it. Annie looked at Elaine. And you can't prove he's lying? Not yet. Annie sat quietly. Everyone else returned to the documents, but her mind stayed with Gregory. He had been confident when he entered Richard's office, not because he knew where Annie was, because he believed he knew what she knew. That distinction mattered. She suddenly looked up. He doesn't know what I told you. Richard stopped reading. What? Mr. Hale knows I made it upstairs. He knows you delayed the deal afterward, so he probably assumes I told you something. Annie leaned forward, but he doesn't know how much. Elaine watched her carefully. Go on. What if he thinks I barely told you anything? Daniel frowned. We can't lie about evidence in an internal investigation. I'm not saying fake evidence. Annie shook her head. I'm saying let him think I panicked before I understood what I saw. Richard's attention was fully on her now. Annie continued. This morning he thought I was too inexperienced to understand the files. He still thinks that. That's why he keeps telling everybody I got confused. A realization moved across Richard's face. If I let him believe his explanation worked, he said, he may stop being careful. Annie nodded. Make him think I didn't tell you anything. The room went silent. Daniel looked unconvinced. You're suggesting we put Gregory in a room with her and hope he talks himself into a confession? No, Annie said. I'm suggesting we let him explain things he shouldn't know I saw. Elaine's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Richard looked at Annie for several seconds. Then, for the first time since she had burst into his office that morning, the corner of his mouth lifted. It was not amusement. It was recognition. Gregory Hale had spent the entire day using Annie's age and position against her. Now Annie wanted to give him exactly what he expected to see, an 18-year-old intern who had been frightened into silence. Richard closed the folder in front of him. All right, he said. Let's find out how much Gregory says when he thinks nobody in the room is smart enough to notice. Richard did not call Gregory immediately. The idea might have come from Annie, but turning it into something useful required more than putting two people in a room and hoping one of them made a mistake. Elaine moved first. If we do this, outside counsel needs to approve the process before Gregory walks through that door. I don't want anything said later about entrapment, coercion, or a contaminated investigation. Richard nodded. Call them. Daniel remained unconvinced. And what exactly are we expecting Annie to do? Pretend she remembers less than she does? Annie looked at him. I don't have to pretend I know less. I just don't have to correct him. Elaine paused at the doorway and glanced back. That distinction matters. Richard pulled out the chair across from his desk. Sit down, Annie. She obeyed, though the moment she lowered herself into the chair, her eyes drifted toward the space beneath the desk. Only a few hours earlier, she had been curled underneath it with one hand over her mouth, listening to Gregory describe her as unstable and dishonest. Now Richard was asking her to sit, where Gregory could see her. He noticed where she was looking. You don't have to do this. Annie looked up. I thought this was my idea. It was. That doesn't mean I'm going to treat an 18-year-old intern like one of my investigators. I'm not asking you to. You may hear him accuse you of stealing. He may question your judgment. He may say things specifically designed to make you defend yourself. Annie leaned back slightly. That part doesn't sound new. Richard almost smiled, but his expression quickly became serious again. You can leave at any point. If you say you're done, the meeting ends. Understand? Yes, sir. No. Richard shook his head. I need you to actually understand it. You don't owe this company courage because someone here frightened you. My job is to make sure adults with power don't use that power against someone who has less of it. For a moment, Annie did not answer. Then she nodded. I understand, and I still want to do it. Richard accepted that. Elaine returned 10 minutes later with outside counsel on speakerphone. The attorney confirmed that the interview could proceed as an internal corporate investigation so long as the purpose was documented, no evidence was fabricated, and Gregory was not falsely told that Annie had made statements she had not made. That means Richard can say she may have misunderstood a draft, Elaine explained after the call, because that is one possibility Gregory has already suggested. Annie can apologize for running. She can ask questions. What we cannot do is manufacture documents or falsely tell Gregory someone has confessed. Daniel crossed his arms. And recording? Elaine answered. The executive conference system can be used under company policy for investigative meetings with proper legal authorization. Outside counsel has approved documentation of the session. Richard looked at Annie. Comfortable with that? More comfortable than relying on my memory. Marcus, who had spent the last 20 minutes preparing a clean set of documents, placed 3 folders on the side table. Nothing sensitive will be visible when Gregory enters. The recovered schedule, server logs, and metadata stay in the conference room with Elaine and outside counsel monitoring remotely. Richard will have only a blank legal pad in the standard Northbridge binder. Annie looked at the folders. So he needs to think you haven't found anything. Not nothing, Richard said. If he thinks I know absolutely nothing, he'll wonder why the closing is delayed. He needs to believe I found enough to be irritated, but not enough to be dangerous. Daniel finally seemed interested. You let him think Annie saw a draft, panicked, and gave you just enough concern to slow the deal down. Richard nodded. And then? Richard looked at Annie. Then we let Gregory do what he has been doing all day. Explain things for me? Explain things no one asked him to explain. Annie understood. They spent the next half hour going through the sequence. Richard would control the conversation. Annie would speak only when invited, or when there was a natural opening. She was not to accuse Gregory directly. She was not to mention the $64 million schedule, the deleted meeting record, Martin Voss's initials, or the side letter. Most importantly, she was not to reveal the exact $18.7 million figure unless Richard gave her the opening. "What if he says I stole the file?" Annie asked. Richard answered, "Don't argue. What if he says I'm lying? Don't argue. What if he says I'm too young to understand what I saw?" Richard paused. "Especially then." Annie let out a breath. "That might be the hardest part. That is why he may believe it." She looked at him. "You want me to look scared?" Richard's expression softened slightly. "You don't have to pretend." Annie gave him a tired look. "Good. Because I'm not sure I could." Elaine moved the chair slightly so Annie would be visible to Gregory the moment he entered. "Don't sit like you're waiting to attack him. Sit the way you would if your boss called you in because you thought you were in trouble." "I'm in trouble." "No," Richard said. "You're in a difficult situation. There's a difference." Annie looked down at her hands. They had finally stopped shaking. Margaret entered at 3:42 p.m. "Northbridge has pushed its deadline to 5. Gregory has asked twice whether you want him upstairs." Richard checked the clock. "Not yet." Margaret looked at Annie, then at the arrangement of the room. She understood immediately. "When?" 3:55. "I'll tell him you want to discuss whether the closing can still happen today." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That should get him here." Richard looked at the closed acquisition binder. "That is the point." At 3:50, Elaine, Marcus, and Daniel moved into the adjoining conference room. The connecting door remained closed. Outside counsel joined the secured line. Margaret confirmed the recording system was active and left. Richard sat behind his desk. Annie took the chair opposite him. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Richard said, "Remember, he expects you to defend yourself. So I don't. He expects you to correct him. So I don't. He expects you to be intimidated by his title." Annie looked at the desk, then back at Richard. "That part he can have." Richard studied her. "You're still afraid of him?" "Yes." "Good." She frowned. "Good? Fear makes people careful. Pride makes them careless." Annie thought about Gregory walking into this office that morning, certain that an intern's word could never compete with his. A knock sounded at the door. This time Annie did not move. Richard glanced at the clock. 3:59 page. Then he looked at her once. "Ready?" Annie drew in a slow breath. "Yes." Richard turned toward the door. "Come in." Gregory Hale stepped into the office wearing the same composed expression he had worn that morning. Then he saw Annie sitting openly across from Richard's desk. For the first time all day, Gregory stopped before he knew what to say. Gregory recovered quickly. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but Annie saw it. His eyes moved from her to Richard, then back again. And by the time he crossed the room, his expression had returned to the calm professionalism that had protected him all day. "Richard," he said, "I wasn't expecting Miss Carter to be here." Richard leaned back in his chair as though the meeting already irritated him. "Neither was I. But since this entire mess appears to have started with her, I thought it was time we finished it in one room." Gregory gave Annie a measured look. It was almost kind. That frightened her more than anger would have. "I agree," he said. "The situation has already consumed far too much time." Annie lowered her eyes, exactly as they had planned. Richard picked up a pen and tapped it once against the blank legal pad. "Annie has explained what happened downstairs. At least, she has explained what she thinks happened." Gregory's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I suspected there had been some misunderstanding." Richard glanced at Annie. "She says she opened a Northbridge disclosure schedule, saw information she didn't understand, took a photograph, then panicked when you asked for the phone." Annie felt the insult in the summary even though she knew Richard was performing it. Gregory accepted the opening immediately. "That is essentially correct. I wouldn't describe her as malicious. Inexperienced, certainly. Poor judgment under pressure. Yes, but I don't think anyone needs to destroy an 18-year-old girl's future over one mistake." Annie kept her face still. There it was again. He was helping her now, making himself generous. Richard nodded slowly. "So you don't recommend termination?" Gregory looked at Annie before answering. "That would be your decision, of course. Personally, I would prefer a formal warning, removal from sensitive work, and perhaps some additional training on confidentiality." Annie almost looked up. This was the same man who had stepped between her and the door that morning and told her one foolish decision could follow her into college. Now he sounded like a patient uncle. Richard said. That seems surprisingly forgiving. Gregory smiled faintly. We were all 18 once. Richard gave no sign that he found the remark interesting. Annie, he said, you wanted to say something. That was her cue. She looked up carefully, keeping her voice small. I'm sorry I ran. Gregory nodded. I appreciate that. I should have handled it differently. Yes, you should have. The softness disappeared from his tone for just a moment. Annie noticed. Richard noticed too. Annie continued. I got confused because there were two versions of the disclosure schedule. Gregory folded his hands in front of him. That happens often in transactions of this size. Documents change constantly during negotiations. So it's normal for numbers to be different? Depending on the stage of the draft. Absolutely. Richard turned toward Gregory. She mentioned liabilities appearing in one version but not another. Gregory did not hesitate. Again, normal. Some items are reclassified, resolved, transferred into schedules, or determined not to be material. A junior employee looking at documents without context can easily assume something has disappeared when it is simply moved. Annie looked down again. Gregory grew more comfortable. She could hear it in the length of his answers. Richard asked, and Arden Strategic Advisory? Gregory's expression remained steady. A Northbridge consultant. What kind? Transaction support, as I understand it. Regulatory coordination, local advisory work, some government, relations, consulting. Richard nodded as though this explanation was enough. So nothing unusual, not remotely. Annie had to stop herself from looking at him. Not remotely. A company tied to nearly $19 million and an address shared by multiple shell entities was now not remotely unusual. Richard turned toward her. Does that answer your question? Annie hesitated, playing the uncertain intern Gregory expected to see. I think so. Gregory smiled at her. Annie, these transactions are complicated even for attorneys who have practiced for 20 years. Seeing something unfamiliar doesn't mean something improper is happening. I understand. What you need to learn, he continued, is that asking questions is fine, but how you ask them matters. Running through the building with confidential information creates unnecessary risk. Annie nodded. I know. Gregory leaned back slightly. He believed the room belonged to him again. Richard let several seconds pass before speaking. Anything else you want to ask him, Annie? She looked at Richard. His face gave her nothing. They had practiced this. Do not rush. Do not sound clever. Let Gregory believe the danger had passed. Annie turned back to him. There was one thing I probably misunderstood. Gregory gave her an encouraging nod. Go ahead. The consulting payment. His face did not change. Annie continued carefully. I thought it was around 18 million, but maybe I read it wrong. Gregory answered before Richard could speak. It wasn't 18. The final number was 18.7. Silence. Annie heard the soft hum of the air conditioning. Nothing else. Gregory's expression remained composed for half a heartbeat longer. Then something changed behind his eyes. Richard slowly placed the pen on the legal pad. Final number? Gregory looked at him. I'm sorry? Richard's voice stayed conversational. You said the final number was 18.7. Gregory adjusted his cuff. Yes, I believe that was the figure in the working schedule. Annie kept her hands folded in her lap. Her heart was pounding, but not the way it had beneath the desk. This time, fear was mixed with something else. He had stepped into it. Richard leaned back. Interesting. Gregory's eyes sharpened. Why? Richard ignored the question. Which working schedule are you referring to? The internal transaction fee schedule. What was the file called? Gregory hesitated again. Only slightly. Then he answered, Northbridge closing schedule, final working draft. Annie felt a second shock move through the room. The exact file title had never appeared in the photograph on her phone. Richard's face remained unreadable. That's quite specific. Gregory gave a small shrug. I review hundreds of transaction documents. Some names stick. Richard nodded. Of course. Gregory looked between them now, less relaxed than before. Is there a problem? Richard reached for the acquisition binder but did not open it. No. I'm trying to understand whether there is one. Gregory leaned forward. Richard, if this is still about what Annie saw this morning, I've already explained it. The disclosure schedules went through multiple iterations. Nothing improper happened. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Good. Gregory blinked. Richard continued, because I'm considering restarting the closing. Relief came too quickly. It was small, but Annie saw it. So am I correct? Richard asked. That none of this affects our ability to close today? Gregory answered immediately. Correct. No undisclosed obligation that would materially change the transaction? No. No arrangement with Martin Voss that the board hasn't reviewed? Gregory's eyes shifted. Then he smiled. Nothing that matters. Richard let the wording hang in the air. Annie could almost feel Gregory trying to decide how much Richard knew. He had made one mistake, then another. Now he was becoming cautious again. Richard knew it too. That meant the next question had to make him comfortable, not cornered. Richard closed the binder. Fine. Then perhaps we've wasted enough time. Gregory relaxed by another inch. Annie looked down to hide what she was thinking. That morning, Gregory had believed her fear made her weak. Now that same belief was making him careless. And Richard had not yet asked the question they were saving for last. Richard allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for Gregory to believe the meeting was winding down. He opened the Northbridge binder, turned one page, then another, and spoke without looking up. Before we restart anything, there is one final point I want cleared up. Gregory shifted in his chair. Of course. Richard traced a finger down the page as though he were checking something routine. The side arrangement. The change in Gregory was small but immediate. His shoulders tightened, and the easy confidence he had regained a few minutes earlier became more deliberate. What side arrangement? Richard looked up. With Voss. Gregory paused. Annie kept her eyes lowered, but she could feel the room changing again. Richard continued in the same calm tone. I'm told there may have been an additional understanding outside the main acquisition agreement. If it is harmless, I'd rather know now than spend another afternoon chasing shadows. Gregory exhaled through his nose and seemed to make a decision. There were several working understandings with Martin during negotiations. None of them changed the economics of the final deal. Richard nodded as if that answer satisfied him. So whatever was discussed separately was superseded? Yes. And nothing survived into closing? Nothing material? Richard leaned back. Good. Gregory relaxed again. Then Richard added, almost casually, because I don't want Voss's side letter turning into a problem after we sign. Gregory answered too quickly. Martin said that letter would never surface. The words were out before he could stop them. Annie raised her eyes. Gregory went completely still. Richard did not move. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Richard asked quietly, What letter? Gregory blinked. The one you just mentioned. No. Richard's voice remained controlled. I said a side arrangement. I never said Martin wrote a letter. Gregory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Richard continued. I also never said it would surface. Gregory's eyes shifted toward Annie. That was the first time all afternoon he looked genuinely afraid. He recovered as quickly as he could. Richard, you're parsing language. We've been negotiating this transaction for nearly 2 years. There have been dozens of side communications, draft understandings, informal notes. What was in the letter? Nothing that affects the deal. That wasn't my question. Gregory straightened. It dealt with post-closing administrative matters. Richard's gaze did not leave him. Which matters? Adjustments, advisory compensation, routine integration issues. Annie saw Richard's expression change at the word compensation. How much? Gregory hesitated. Richard leaned forward. You already told us Arden's final number was 18.7 million. You already named a deleted working draft Annie never showed you. Now you've identified a letter I never told you Martin wrote. So this is the part where you stop deciding what I'm allowed to know. Gregory's face hardened. For the first time, the polished legal officer disappeared, and something colder took his place. This company would not be where it is without people like me making difficult decisions before they ever reached your desk. Richard's voice stayed low. That sounds less like an explanation than a confession. It's reality. No, it's convenience. Gregory looked toward Annie. And this is what we're doing now? Rebuilding 2 years of work around the interpretation of an intern? Annie felt the old instinct to defend herself, but she remembered Richard's instruction. Do not correct him. Do not rush. Let him talk. Richard answered instead. You keep coming back to her title. Because it matters. She doesn't understand transaction structure, privilege, materiality, or acquisition risk. Annie looked up at him now. Gregory saw it and continued. She opened a working file, misunderstood it, photographed privileged material, and ran. You're giving her confusion the same weight as 15 years of judgment. Richard's expression hardened. No, I'm giving evidence more weight than your title. Gregory turned back to him. Evidence? You have fragments, metadata, draft schedules. None of that proves I did anything improper. Richard nodded once. You're right. Gregory seemed surprised. Richard continued. The deleted file doesn't prove intent. The shell companies don't prove intent. The meeting record with Voss doesn't prove intent. Gregory seized the opening. Exactly. But you just did. Silence. Gregory's face tightened. Richard pointed toward Annie. She told you the payment was around 18 million. You corrected her to the exact final amount. She never gave you the deleted file title. You did, and when I mentioned a side arrangement with Voss, you told me Martin said the letter would never surface. Gregory leaned back. You're twisting ordinary deal knowledge into wrongdoing. No, I'm listening to what you know. Gregory's tone sharpened. Then listen carefully. The Northbridge transaction had problems. Every large acquisition does. Voss wanted certain liabilities kept outside the main disclosure package until after closing because he believed they were overstated. I negotiated protections. For whom? For Whitmore. Richard's eyes narrowed. Then why wasn't I told? Because if every unresolved issue had reached you, this deal would never have closed. That decision was mine. Gregory gave a bitter laugh. Was it? You told me to get the transaction done. I told you to protect the company. And I did. By hiding liabilities? By controlling them. By moving payments through shell entities. Gregory's jaw tightened. Richard watched him. That answer took too long. Gregory looked toward the door now. Annie noticed. So did Richard. You're not leaving yet. Gregory turned back. Am I being detained? No, you're free to leave whenever you want. Richard's voice remained even. But if you walk out before answering, that becomes part of the record too. Gregory's eyes narrowed. What record? Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached toward the phone on his desk. Annie understood what was coming. Gregory did too. His face changed. Richard pressed the intercom. Elaine, come in. The adjoining door opened. Elaine entered first, followed by Daniel and Marcus. Elaine carried the recovered schedules. Marcus had the server logs. Daniel held a folder containing the archived calendar metadata. Gregory stared at them. Richard looked at him. You asked what evidence I have. Elaine placed the first document on the desk. Richard continued. Now you can see it. Gregory's composure finally cracked. Not completely, but enough. He looked at Annie again. This time there was no condescension in his eyes. Only calculation. Annie had spent the morning being afraid that Gregory Hale's title would make everyone believe him before they believed her. Now the room had changed. His title was still the same. The difference was that the evidence had finally caught up to it. Gregory looked at the documents spread across Richard's desk and seemed to understand that the conversation had moved beyond anything he could dismiss as an intern's mistake. Elaine placed the recovered payment schedule beside the server logs. Marcus added the archive showing Gregory's access to the deleted side letter file, while Daniel remained standing near the end of the desk, his expression no longer skeptical. Gregory looked at each of them in turn. So this is what you've been doing all day. Richard did not answer the accusation. You told me there were no undisclosed obligations that could materially affect the transaction. There aren't. Elaine tapped the recovered schedule, then explained the $64 million routed through entities with overlapping registered addresses. Consulting arrangements. Approved by whom? Legal reviewed them. Richard's eyes hardened. You are legal. Gregory turned toward him. Richard, if you want to reduce 15 years of work to a few accounting codes, go ahead. But don't pretend you don't understand how acquisitions at this level operate. Northbridge had liabilities. Voss wanted flexibility. We negotiated ways to keep those issues from destroying the economics of the deal. By removing them from the final disclosures, by managing them, Daniel finally spoke. There's a difference between managing a liability and making sure the board never sees it. Gregory looked at him sharply. You've signed off on plenty of adjustments you didn't personally investigate. Not ones hidden from me. Gregory gave a short laugh and turned back to Richard. This is exactly what I mean. Everyone in this room knows how business works, until somebody gets nervous and suddenly wants to pretend every deal is built in a Sunday school classroom. Annie had been silent, but that sentence made her look up. Richard noticed. You seem very comfortable calling dishonesty practicality, he said. Gregory's patience finally broke. Because I'm comfortable admitting that large companies survive by making difficult choices. You hired me to solve problems, not bring every ugly detail upstairs and ask permission to breathe. I hired you to protect this company, and I did. Richard glanced at the documents. By arranging $18.7 million in advisory compensation through a company I had never heard of? Gregory's jaw tightened. By working with Martin Voss on a side letter the board never reviewed? It was provisional. Then why delete the meeting record? I didn't. Why open the side letter again last night? Gregory hesitated. There it was again. A fraction of a second. The kind of pause that had started all of this. Richard leaned forward. You knew the exact payment. You knew the deleted file title. You knew Martin had promised the letter would never surface. And now you want me to believe you were simply cleaning up paperwork? Gregory looked around the office, perhaps searching for someone still willing to give him the benefit of 15 years. Nobody did. His eyes settled on Annie. This whole thing started because of her. Annie felt the old pressure return, but she no longer lowered her gaze. Gregory pointed toward her. She had no context, no legal training, no understanding of how a transaction like this works. She saw numbers she didn't recognize, took a photograph she had no right to take, and turned a routine internal matter into a corporate crisis. Richard's voice became very quiet. Be careful. No, you be careful. Gregory stepped closer to the desk. You are about to destroy the largest acquisition this company has ever attempted because an 18-year-old intern got frightened by a spreadsheet. Richard stared at him. Then he said, No. Gregory stopped. Richard rose slowly from his chair. I'm not destroying this deal because Annie got frightened. He glanced once toward her, then back at Gregory. I'm destroying it because my chief legal officer just confirmed what the intern found. The room went silent. Gregory's face changed. What did you say? Richard reached for the phone. Margaret, his executive assistant, answered immediately. I'm here. Cancel the Northbridge transaction. Even through the speaker, Margaret's hesitation was audible. Cancel, sir? Not postpone? Cancel it. Gregory stepped forward. Richard, don't do this. Richard did not look at him. Notify the board that we are terminating the closing process pending investigation of undisclosed liabilities, questionable payment arrangements, and potential conflicts involving senior legal personnel. Margaret's voice became careful. Understood. And notify Northbridge Council in writing. No calls until outside counsel approves the language. Yes, sir. Richard ended the call. Gregory stared at him as though he had just watched someone set fire to 2 years of work. You have any idea what you just cost this company? Richard placed both hands on the desk. Not yet. Hundreds of millions before this is over. Financing fees, break costs, market reaction, litigation. The board may remove you for this. Then they remove me. Gregory shook his head. For her? Richard's eyes narrowed. You still don't understand. He picked up the forensic summary and placed it directly in front of Gregory. I didn't make this decision based on Annie. He tapped the documents. I made it based on evidence. Then he looked toward her. She only showed me where to look. For the first time, Gregory's composure disappeared completely. You think she saved you? He said. She may have ruined both of you. Voss will sue. The banks will walk. Regulators will crawl through every transaction this company has done for 10 years. Richard nodded. Then we'll answer their questions. You're willing to risk your entire company? I'm willing to find out what kind of company I actually own. Gregory turned to Annie. The civility vanished. You have no idea what you've done. Annie's stomach tightened, but this time she stood. Gregory continued. You're 18 years old. You think noticing a few numbers means you understand how the world works? Richard started to speak. Annie lifted one hand slightly. She wanted to answer for herself. No, she said. I don't understand everything. Gregory gave a bitter smile. Annie continued, her voice steadier now. But I understood enough to know you were lying. The smile disappeared. You've destroyed your future. No. Annie looked directly at him. I almost lost my future because I saw what you were doing. Richard pressed the intercom again. Security. Gregory looked toward him. You're having me escorted out? You are suspended effective immediately. Your system access is terminated, your company devices will be preserved, and you are not to contact Northbridge personnel except through outside counsel. Gregory laughed once without humor. After 15 years. Richard met his eyes. 15 years is exactly why this costs as much as it does. Two security officers appeared at the door. Gregory looked at Richard one final time, then at Annie. He seemed about to say something, but whatever threat or argument he had left would no longer change anything. He walked out without resistance. The door closed behind him. Annie remained standing. For hours she had believed justice would feel like relief. Instead she felt tired. Richard seemed to understand. He looked at the empty chair where Gregory had been sitting. Firing one man doesn't fix this. Elaine gathered the evidence. No, now we find out how far it goes. Richard looked at the cancelled acquisition binder, then at Annie. The largest deal of his career was dead. Gregory Hale was gone, but the harder question remained. How much damage had been done during all the years everyone trusted the man with the title more than the people who might have questioned him? By 6 that evening, Whitmore Tower no longer felt like the same build. The North Bridge closing had been cancelled. Gregory's access had been terminated, and outside counsel had taken control of the internal investigation. What had begun with one frightened intern hiding under a desk had become a company-wide preservation order covering legal files, payment records, executive communications, vendor contracts, and every transaction in which Gregory Hale had exercised unusual authority. Richard remained in his office while Elaine coordinated with investigators. Daniel was downstairs speaking with the board. And Margaret had spent nearly 2 hours fielding calls from bankers, attorneys, and Northbridge executives who wanted answers. Richard was not yet prepared to give. Annie sat near the window with a paper cup of water in her hands. She had stopped shaking, but exhaustion had taken its place. Every few minutes she looked at her phone, where 3 unread messages from her mother waited. Richard noticed. "Go call her." Annie looked up. "I don't know what I'm allowed to say." "You can tell her you're safe. Your job is safe, and you'll be home late. Don't discuss the investigation." She hesitated. "Is my job actually safe?" Richard gave her a tired look. "At this point, Annie, you may be the only employee in this building whose position I'm not worried about." That made her laugh for the first time in hours. She stepped into the adjoining room and called Denise. Her mother answered immediately. "Annie Carter, I have been trying not to call you every 10 minutes. I know. I'm sorry. Are you all right?" "Yes, ma'am." "Really?" Annie leaned against the wall. "Really? It's just been a long day." Denise was quiet for a moment. "Did somebody treat you badly?" Annie closed her eyes. Her mother had always been able to reach the important question without knowing the details. "Yes." "And did you let them convince you that meant you had done something wrong?" "No." "Good." Annie smiled faintly. "I might be home after 8. I'll keep dinner warm." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's why it's called being your mother." When Annie returned to Richard's office, Elaine was standing beside the desk with a new folder. "We've made the initial notifications," she said. "Independent investigators will begin interviews tomorrow morning. We've also contacted federal counsel regarding several of the payment structures. Depending on what the records establish, this could involve wire fraud, false disclosures, obstruction, conspiracy, and improper payments." Annie looked toward Richard. "Does that mean Gregory is going to be arrested?" "Not tonight," Elaine replied. "And maybe not soon. Investigations don't work like television. Evidence has to be authenticated, witnesses interviewed, money traced. What we have is serious, but serious is not the same as proven." Annie nodded. She was beginning to understand that justice moved much more slowly after the dramatic part was over. Richard looked at the folder. "What about Voss? Northbridge has retained separate counsel. Their board claims it was unaware of any side arrangement." Daniel entered before Richard could respond. His tie was loosened, and he looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "The board meeting is over." Richard waited. "They're furious. I expected that. They want an independent review of management oversight, not just Gregory's conduct." Richard nodded. "They should." Daniel looked surprised. "You're not going to fight it?" "No. You understand they may conclude you failed in your supervisory responsibilities." Richard leaned back in his chair. "I did fail in my supervisory responsibilities." The answer quieted the room. Daniel frowned. "Gregory concealed information from you." "Yes. That's not the same thing." "No. But I built a system where he was rewarded for making problems disappear before they reached me." Richard looked toward the closed Northbridge binder. "If I take credit when 12,000 people make this company successful, I don't get to pretend responsibility stops at my office door when one of them abuses the authority I gave him." Annie watched Daniel absorb that. She had expected a billionaire to protect his reputation first. Instead, Richard seemed more interested in identifying where his own judgment had failed. The next morning, he repeated the same idea to senior employees during a brief internal address. He did not name Annie. He did not announce Gregory's guilt. He simply confirmed that Northbridge had been canceled because Whitmore had discovered information requiring independent investigation. Then he said, "Leadership is not only taking credit for what happens under your name, it is accepting responsibility for what you failed to see." The sentence spread through the company before lunchtime. So did Annie's name. By the end of the week, enough people had heard fragments of the story that strangers began recognizing her in elevators. Some congratulated her. Others smiled too brightly and called her the brave little intern. One senior manager told a coworker within Annie's hearing that she had been incredibly lucky to stumble onto the right spreadsheet. Annie said nothing until Elaine found her later in the break room. "You all right?" Annie stirred sugar into a coffee she did not really want. "It's funny. When they thought I was wrong, I was too inexperienced to understand what I saw. Now that I was right, I was lucky." Elaine smiled without humor. "People sometimes prefer luck. It lets them avoid admitting someone they overlooked was paying better attention than they were." Annie looked at her. "Does that ever stop?" "No." The honesty surprised her. Elaine added, "But eventually you stop needing everybody to understand." That evening, Annie finally made it home before dark. Denise had baked chicken in the oven with collard greens and cornbread on the table. The kitchen looked exactly as it had before Gregory Hale, Northbridge, and $64 million entered their lives. Prescription bottles sat near the microwave. An electric bill remained clipped beneath a magnet on the refrigerator. Annie looked around and realized how little justice had changed the things that mattered immediately. Denise placed a plate in front of her. "You look disappointed. I thought doing the right thing would feel bigger." Her mother sat across from her. "Baby, doing the right thing doesn't always change your life overnight." Annie looked down at her plate. Denise reached across the table and touched her hand. "Sometimes it just keeps the wrong person from changing it for you." Weeks passed. Investigators traced payments, reviewed old transactions, and interviewed employees who had once been afraid to question Gregory. Northbridge continued denying wrongdoing, while federal authorities requested additional records. Richard faced criticism from shareholders and the board, and Whitmore Capital absorbed substantial losses from the failed acquisition. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Annie received a message from Margaret. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you." Same office, same desk, but this time, no one was chasing her. Annie stood outside Richard Whitmore's office for several seconds before knocking. The last time she had entered this room, she had been running hard enough to taste blood at the back of her throat. Now Margaret had scheduled the meeting on her calendar, security knew her name, and no one was trying to take the phone from her hand. "Come in," Richard called. Annie opened the door. The office had not changed. The same Atlanta skyline filled the windows, the same walnut desk occupied the center of the room, and for one brief moment her eyes went automatically to the space underneath it. Richard noticed, "I promise you won't need to use that today." Annie smiled. "That's reassuring." He motioned toward the chair across from him. "Sit down." A folder rested on the desk between them. It was much thinner than the Northbridge acquisition binder that had once occupied the same space. Annie sat. "Am I in trouble again?" "No." "Good. I've had enough character building for one summer." Richard almost laughed. Over the past several weeks, she had become less nervous around him. Although she still called him Mr. Whitmore, and still sat straighter in his office than she did anywhere else. He folded his hands. "The independent review is continuing. I can't discuss details that haven't been made public, but investigators have confirmed enough irregularities that the Northbridge cancellation was justified." "What about Mr. Hale?" "His attorneys are handling communications now. Federal investigators are reviewing several transactions. What happens next will depend on evidence, not what either of us wants to happen." Annie nodded. She had learned not to expect justice to arrive on schedule. "And Martin Voss?" Northbridge's board opened its own investigation. He has stepped away from day-to-day responsibilities while that proceeds. "So nobody gets marched away in handcuffs?" Richard leaned back. "I'm afraid real life is usually less satisfying in the first act." Annie smiled faintly. "It would have been nice. It would also have been premature." She knew that. Elaine had spent weeks teaching her the difference between suspicion, evidence, charges, and proof. Annie had started the summer believing that seeing the truth was the difficult part. Now she understood that proving it fairly could be harder. Richard slid the folder toward her. "What's this?" "Open it." Annie did. Inside was a letter bearing the name of an independent educational foundation and a second page describing tuition support, books, required fees, and other education expenses. She read the first paragraph twice. Then she closed the folder. "No." Richard's eyebrows rose. "That was quick. I can't take this." "Why?" "You know why. I'm asking because apparently I don't." Annie pushed the folder gently back toward him. "People already say I got lucky. If Whitmore pays for my school after what happened, somebody will say I got paid for keeping quiet. Or that I made everything bigger than it was because I wanted something." Richard watched her without interrupting. "I didn't say anything because I wanted a reward," Annie continued. "I said something because the numbers were wrong." "I know. Then I don't want money attached to it." Richard nodded slowly. "That is why Whitmore Capital is not offering you money." Annie frowned. He pushed the folder back. "The scholarship is administered by an independent foundation. There is no employment requirement, no confidentiality agreement, no obligation to return here, and no condition tied to the investigation. If you decide tomorrow that you never want to walk into this building again, the scholarship remains yours." She looked down at the papers. "It still feels like a reward." "Then don't take it as one." Richard's tone softened. "Take it because talent shouldn't disappear, just because money is tight." Annie did not answer. He continued. "You noticed a discrepancy because you were patient enough to do work other people considered unimportant. You remembered addresses. You asked questions when an executive told you not to. None of that makes you an accountant yet, but it tells me you could become a very good one." Annie touched the edge of the folder. "My mother is going to cry. Is that a yes?" "It's a warning." Richard smiled. Annie looked through the scholarship information again. "I was planning to study business administration." "Was?" She thought about the previous weeks. Server logs, payment schedules, shell companies. Elaine explaining how auditors followed patterns through records that people assumed no one would ever compare. "I think I want forensic accounting." Richard nodded as though he had expected it. "And maybe corporate compliance. After what happened here, I would consider that a reasonable career choice." Annie looked at him. "You know I might spend my whole career making people like you uncomfortable. I'm counting on it." Several months later, the investigation was still moving. Some findings became public. Others remained confidential. And Richard testified before his own board about the failures that had allowed Gregory to operate without enough oversight. Whitmore Capital changed its whistleblower procedures, separated several compliance functions from legal leadership, and created a direct reporting channel employees could use without going through department heads. Richard resisted anyone who tried to call the changes proof that the company had fixed itself. Policies could reduce risk. They could not replace character. 1 year after the morning Annie Carter ran through Whitmore Tower, she returned through the front entrance wearing a new badge. Summer analyst. She was 19 now and completing her first year of college courses. Her mother's health still had difficult weeks. Their car still made a grinding sound every cold morning. Annie still packed lunch more often than she bought it downtown. Not everything needed to become glamorous for life to improve. She was passing Richard's office when he looked up and saw her. "Annie." She stopped at the doorway. His eyes moved deliberately toward the walnut desk. "Planning to hide under there again?" Annie followed his gaze. For a second, she remembered the carpet against her knees, Gregory's polished shoes only feet away, and the terrible certainty that one powerful man could destroy her future simply because people would believe him first. Then she looked back at Richard. "Not this time." "Why not?" Annie smiled. "Because now I know what to do when someone powerful tells me to stay quiet." Richard gave a small nod. No speech followed. None was needed. Annie continued down the hallway toward her department, passing assistants, attorneys, analysts, and executives who were already beginning another ordinary business day. The desk behind her had not changed. The building had not become perfect. Justice had not suddenly made every powerful person fair, or every vulnerable person safe. But Annie had changed. A year earlier, she had needed the shadow beneath a billionaire's desk to protect her long enough to speak. Now she walked through the same building in plain sight, carrying the lesson that had cost Gregory Hale his power. and Richard Whitmore billions of dollars to learn. A title might decide who gets heard first. It should never decide who is telling the truth. This story reminds us that truth does not become less valuable just because it comes from someone young, powerless, or easy to overlook. Annie had no title, money, or influence, yet she had the courage to speak when staying silent would have been safer. Richard's choice teaches an equally important lesson. Real leadership means questioning even the people we trust when the facts no longer make sense. Justice is not always immediate or perfect, but it begins when someone is willing to listen, someone is brave enough to speak, and neither power nor status is allowed to decide who deserves to be believed. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.